It was 2017, late autumn, when I decided to take a solo camping trip through France. I had been traveling through Europe for months, living out of my backpack, spending nights under the open sky, and avoiding hostels when I could. I liked the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being disconnected from everything. I had set up camp deep in a remote part of the French countryside, somewhere near the Vosges Mountains. I had done my research. There was a vast stretch of forest with few hikers, no major trails, and no towns nearby. Perfect. I had parked my rental car at a dirt road entrance, shouldered my pack, and hiked in for about 4 hours before picking a spot. There was no sign of other campers, no footprints, no fire pits, just untouched wilderness. I found a small clearing surrounded by dense trees and set up my one-person tent. It was peaceful, quiet except for the wind moving through the trees and the occasional chirp of distant birds. I spent the first night by the fire, eating a simple meal of bread and canned food, sipping water from my flask. The sky was clear, and I remember staring up at the stars, feeling that deep sense of calm that only comes when you're completely alone in nature. But that peace didn't last. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore the area. I followed a small stream that ran through the trees, making my way deeper into the woods. The air was crisp, the scent of damp leaves and pine filling my lungs. I walked for maybe an hour before I found something that made me stop. It was a fire pit, not an old, abandoned one, but a fresh one. The ashes were still dark, slightly damp from the morning dew, and there were footprints in the dirt around it. I crouched down, running my fingers through the ashes. They were cold. The fire hadn't been burning for at least a day, maybe more. I looked around, scanning the forest. I hadn't seen anyone hiking on my way in. No signs of people at all. I hadn't heard another soul the whole night before. So who had been here? The strangest part was the lack of camping gear. No discarded food wrappers, no sleeping bag imprints, no sign of a tent. Just a fire pit. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter had stopped for the night and moved on. Maybe another camper had come through and left. I turned back and made my way to camp. That night, I built another fire and sat watching the flames flicker in the dark. I had a book with me, something I had picked up in a secondhand shop back in Paris, but I wasn't reading. I just sat there listening to the woods. Then I heard it, a crunch, not an animal noise, not the sound of wind pushing through leaves, a distinct, deliberate crunch of a boot against the forest floor. I froze, my eyes locked onto the dark wall of trees beyond the firelight. Nothing moved. I waited, ears straining, heart pounding. Silence. For a long time, I sat there, unmoving, staring into the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But I didn't go into my tent for a long time. I just sat there waiting, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I crawled into my sleeping bag. The fire was still burning, and the soft crackling was comforting. I kept my knife close, just in case. I slept lightly, waking up at every small sound, but nothing happened. The next day, I packed up some food and decided to hike further out, this time in the opposite direction of where I had found the fire pit. I needed to clear my head, convince myself that everything was fine. The sun was out, and the forest felt normal again, peaceful. I followed the stream, keeping my eyes on the water, watching the way it twisted and turned through the land. Then I saw him, a man, standing on the other side of the stream. He was maybe 50 feet away, partially hidden by the trees, but I could see him clearly. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me, my body locked up. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at him, but it felt like forever. Then, slowly, he stepped backward into the trees and disappeared. I didn't hear him move, didn't hear leaves rustle, It was like he melted into the forest. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I turned and walked back to camp as quickly as I could without running. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was starting to set. I had the overwhelming urge to leave, to pack up and get out. But the thought of hiking back to the car in the dark was worse. I built another fire, bigger this time, and sat with my back against my tent, my knife in my lap. Every little sound put me on edge. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig. It all felt too loud, too close. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start. The fire was still burning, but it was lower now, the embers glowing red. And there, right at the edge of the trees, was another fire, smaller than mine but fresh. And beside it, the man, sitting on a log, staring into the flames. He wasn't looking at me, but he didn't have to. He knew I was there. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just watched him. He sat there for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, he stood up and kicked dirt over the fire, putting it out. And then he turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep. I packed up my gear before the sun even rose, shoving everything into my pack as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just started walking, fast. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like he was just out of sight, keeping pace with me, hidden behind the trees. I didn't stop, didn't rest. By the time I reached my car, my legs were shaking, my lungs burning. I threw my pack into the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a few seconds, gripping the wheel, trying to slow my breathing. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw something. Movement, a figure, far back at the tree line, watching. I didn't hesitate. I started the car and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, in a small town, surrounded by people. I never went back, never camped alone again, and I never forgot the man in the woods. I've never liked camping in the rain. Something about the way the sound of water drowns out everything else unsettles me. You don't hear the wind moving through the trees the same way. You don't hear small animals shifting around in the underbrush. And worst of all, you don't hear people approaching. That night, I was out in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in the forests of northern Montana. I had been driving for most of the day, looking for a good place to set up camp. I wasn't in an official campsite. I had decided to go off-road, deeper into the woods, somewhere I could be alone. I preferred it that way. By the time I found a decent clearing, the sky had already turned gray. The air was thick with moisture, and I could smell the coming rain. I set up quickly, pitching my small one-person tent and gathering some dry wood before it got too wet to burn. I had a simple plan for the night: cook some food, sit by the fire for a while, and get some rest before heading out the next morning. The rain started just as I got my fire going. It wasn't heavy at first, just a light drizzle tapping against the leaves overhead. I sat by the fire, eating a can of beans, listening to the soft sound of raindrops hitting the tarp I had set up over my fire. Felt peaceful at first, calming even, but that feeling didn't last. As the rain got heavier, the forest around me seemed to change. The sounds of the woods faded, replaced by the constant patter of water against leaves, against the ground, against my tent. The fire struggled to stay alive, the flames hissing as raindrops hit the wood. I threw on more fuel, trying to keep it going as long as I could. At some point, I realized just how isolated I was. The nearest road was miles away, and as far as I knew, there wasn't a soul for miles. Just me, my small fire, and the endless stretch of dark, wet forest. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost hidden beneath the rain. A soft, deliberate crunch. Footsteps. I froze, straining to hear through the downpour. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the sound of the rain hitting the ground differently in some spots. But then I heard it again. Closer. Slow, deliberate steps on wet leaves. I turned, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything beyond the trees, just the dim outlines of the forest, shifting in the wind. The fire wasn't bright enough to reach that far. I sat still, barely breathing. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the woods, but the footsteps sounded too careful, too steady. Animals don't move like that. I stood up slowly, grabbing the hatchet I had brought along. I wasn't planning on using it for anything but chopping firewood, but at that moment, it felt like the only thing standing between me and whatever was out there. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Nothing but rain. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the rain was playing tricks on my ears. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there, and it was watching me. I sat back down by the fire, pretending not to notice. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was aware. I wanted them to think I was just another camper, clueless, unaware. Minutes passed. The rain grew heavier. The fire burned lower. Then, another sound. Not footsteps this time. Something closer. A soft rustling just beyond the edge of the clearing. Someone or something moving just out of sight. I gripped my hatchet tighter. The fire was dying, and I knew I needed to make a decision soon. I could sit here and hope whoever was out there lost interest, or I could pack up and get the hell out. I chose the second option. Moving as quietly as I could, I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything, just trees and rain. I packed fast, shoving everything into my bag, not caring if it was wet. I left the fire burning as long as I could, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. The moment I had everything packed, I grabbed my gear and started moving. I didn't run. Running in the dark, in the rain, in unfamiliar woods was a good way to get hurt. I walked quickly, keeping my flashlight low, checking over my shoulder every few steps. I didn't see anything, but I still felt it. Something was following me. I could hear it now, the faint crunch of footsteps behind me, matching my pace. Not running, just walking, watching. I pushed forward, my heart pounding. My truck was parked a few miles away, and if I could just make it there, I'd be safe. The rain made it hard to move quickly. The ground was slick, the mud pulling at my boots. I slipped once, catching myself before I fell. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. I turned my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. I kept moving. The closer I got to my truck, the faster I moved. The footsteps stayed with me, always just far enough that I couldn't see who or what was making them. Then I saw it, the faint glint of my truck's headlights in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I picked up my pace, almost running now. Then, just as I reached the truck, I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. A low, deliberate exhale. Right behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't look. I yanked open the door, threw my bag inside, and slammed it shut. My hands fumbled for the keys, shaking as I shoved them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I hit the gas. As I pulled away, my headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the forest ahead. For a split second, just before I turned onto the road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall, motionless, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I was miles away, until the rain had let up, until the forest was nothing but a dark blur in my mirror. I never went back to that spot. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't ever want to find out. I don't know why I went back to the woods. Maybe it was because they were familiar. Maybe I thought being alone in the quiet would help me think straight. Maybe I thought she would have wanted me to. It had been a little over a year since my wife passed. I had gotten used to the silence, or at least I told myself I had. But the silence of the house felt different from the silence of the woods. The house was just empty. The woods were alive. I picked a spot deep in the wilderness of northern Montana, somewhere far enough that no one would bother me. I used to camp with her all the time. I knew how to set up a proper site, how to ration food, how to make sure I wasn't leaving signs that could attract predators. I figured I would stay for a few days, clear my head, and then head back to a life that felt too hollow. The drive took hours. The last stretch of road was nothing more than dirt and gravel, winding through miles of dense pine trees. I parked off the side of a forgotten path, one that looked barely used. From there, I hiked in. My pack was heavy, but I liked it that way. The weight grounded me. I knew I had enough supplies for at least 5 days, but I also knew I'd probably leave before then. I had a habit of leaving things unfinished since she died. The first night was uneventful. The air was crisp, and the forest smelled of damp earth. I cooked a simple meal, ate by the fire, and then sat in the dark for a long time. I didn't listen to music. I didn't check my phone. I just sat. Felt right. I woke up early the next morning, the kind of early where the sky is still a dark shade of blue, just before sunrise. I made coffee over the fire, sipped it slow, and listened to the forest wake up. Birds, the distant crack of tree branches, the rustling of undergrowth as animals moved through it. I spent the day hiking further into the woods. I didn't bring a map, but I had a good sense of direction. I followed a stream for most of the morning, keeping it within earshot so I wouldn't get turned around. At some point, I stopped and sat on a fallen tree, watching the water flow over smooth stones. It was peaceful. Then I noticed the footprints. They were old, pressed into the damp soil near the edge of the water. Bigger than mine, but not by much. Maybe a hiker, maybe a hunter. But they were deep, which meant whoever left them was carrying weight. I followed them for a little while, not because I was worried, but because I was curious. They led up along the bank, then into the trees. After a few minutes, they disappeared into the undergrowth. Whoever made them had been here a while ago. I let it go and turned back toward my camp. That night, I built the fire bigger than usual. Maybe it was because of the tracks, or maybe I just didn't like the way the trees felt when the sun went down. The woods had a way of shifting at night. Things that felt welcoming in the daylight turned strange. I lay in my tent for a long time, staring at the ceiling. That's when I heard it. Not an animal, not the wind. Something walking, slow, deliberate. The sound was faint, almost like it didn't want to be heard. I stayed still, listening. It was coming from the direction of the stream. My fire had burned low, just enough to cast a faint orange glow outside my tent. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, nothing happened. Then I heard something else. Breathing, not mine. It was low and steady, just beyond the edge of the light. It stayed there for what felt like forever. Then slowly it faded away. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The fire had burned out, and the forest looked the same as it had the day before. But I knew what I had heard. I packed my things and decided to head back toward my truck. Maybe I had been out there long enough. The hike back was slower than I remembered. The forest felt different. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something between the trees. But there was nothing. Then I saw the footprints again. New ones. They were next to mine, following mine. Whoever had been out there last night had followed me. They had stood just beyond the firelight, watching, and now they had retraced my steps. I picked up my pace. The air felt thicker, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I reached my truck just as the sun started setting. My keys were in my pocket. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and slid behind the wheel. The engine turned over, loud in the quiet. I looked up once just before putting it in gear. There was a figure at the edge of the tree line. Not an animal, not a hiker, just standing there, watching. I drove away without looking back. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun had disappeared completely. I found a motel, paid for a room in cash, and locked the door behind me. I didn't check the woods for one last look. I didn't try to understand what had happened. I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, listening to the silence. I never went camping alone again. I never liked the idea of camping near a graveyard. It just felt wrong. Not because of any ghost stories or superstition, just the thought of lying down near buried people, like I was intruding on something meant to be left alone. But this trip wasn't about comfort. It was about getting away. It was the middle of October, a cold, damp time of year in the countryside. I had spent weeks trying to clear my head after quitting a job I hated, and I figured a few nights alone in nature would do me good. I had driven deep into the countryside, miles away from any town, and parked my truck near an old, overgrown cemetery. It wasn't some fancy, well-kept graveyard with marble headstones and fresh flowers. It was the kind of place that had been forgotten, where the graves were old and sunken, the names worn away by rain, and the trees had started reclaiming the land. The only reason I even stopped there was because it was the only clearing I could find before dark. I stepped out of my truck, stretching my legs. The air smelled like wet leaves and dirt, with a cold bite that settled deep in my bones. The cemetery wasn't fenced off, just a scattering of gravestones beyond a patch of trees. I told myself I wasn't really camping in the graveyard, just near it. Still, I felt uneasy as I set up my tent. The ground was soft, the grass damp from the rain earlier that day. I cleared a small space, flattening the dirt as best as I could before pitching the tent. As I worked, I kept glancing at the graves in the distance. Some were just broken chunks of stone, others tilted at odd angles, almost swallowed by the earth. A few were covered in thick moss, looking more like part of the forest than markers of the dead. I built a small fire to keep warm. The flames crackled, sending flickers of light through the trees. I sat close to it, eating a simple meal, trying to focus on the warmth instead of the unsettling feeling creeping in. The wind made strange sounds through the trees, long, drawn-out whistles that rose and fell like voices. It was just the wind. I told myself that over and over. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. The fire burned lower, and I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap tight. The fabric blocked out most of the outside world, but I could still hear the wind, the rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. It was normal, just the sounds of nature. Then, sometime past midnight, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I lay still, listening. My breath felt too loud in the silence. The wind had died down. No rustling, no distant sounds of animals moving through the underbrush. Just dead silence. Then a sound, soft, slow, like something moving through the grass. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying. It was heavier, deliberate. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound came again. Footsteps, slow and careful, moving near my tent. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but I knew better. I've spent enough time outdoors to recognize the difference between a passing animal and something on 2 feet. I stayed completely still, heart pounding. The steps circled my tent, not rushing, not hesitant, just moving. I reached for the knife I always kept with me. My fingers wrapped around the handle, but I didn't move. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. Then the steps stopped, right next to my tent. The fabric barely moved, but I felt the presence just outside. Standing there, listening, I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps moved away. Not into the trees, not toward the road, just deeper into the graveyard. I didn't move for a long time. My muscles ached from staying so still, but I wasn't about to risk making a sound. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, the first light of dawn was seeping through the tent. I unzipped the flap cautiously, scanning the area. Everything looked the same. The fire had burned out. The graves stood silent and undisturbed. But then I saw them. Footprints, not my own. Not leading toward my tent, but away from it. Straight into the cemetery, where they stopped at a sunken grave. I packed up and left. I didn't run, didn't panic, just moved quickly, keeping my eyes on the trees. I didn't stop until I was back in my truck, the engine roaring to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The graveyard faded into the distance, swallowed by the trees. But the footprints, they stayed in my mind. Someone had been there that night, watching, listening, and they never left. I had always been someone who enjoyed being alone in the outdoors. There was something about being away from the noise of the city, the distractions of modern life, and the never-ending responsibilities that weighed on me. Camping was my way of escaping it all, of resetting my mind. That's why I found myself deep in the woods that night, alone with nothing but my gear, a small campfire, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I had picked a remote spot, somewhere off the main trail where few people ever ventured. I liked it that way. The further away from people I was, the better. I had parked my truck a few miles back, hidden away on an old logging road, and hiked in with my pack. By the time I set up camp, the sun was already beginning to set. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. It was perfect. At least it should have been. I started my fire as the last light of the day disappeared behind the treetops. I had a simple meal, a can of beans and some jerky, washing it down with water from my flask. The woods were quiet, too quiet. There were no usual sounds of crickets or distant animal calls, just the wind shifting through the trees. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, convincing myself that I was overthinking it. After all, I had camped alone many times before. I let the fire die down to embers and climbed into my tent, zipping it up behind me. The night was cold, and I bundled myself in my sleeping bag, listening to the stillness outside. I told myself that I'd sleep well, that I'd wake up early and hike out after breakfast. That was the plan. But sleep never came. Sometime past midnight, I heard something, a crunch, the sound of something moving in the woods just outside my camp. My body tensed immediately, my mind instantly alert. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. It was deliberate, a slow, steady movement, not an animal scurrying through the brush, not the wind, something else. I stayed as still as possible, waiting. The sound stopped. Nothing but silence again. I waited longer, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe just the forest settling. And then another step, this time right outside my tent. A wave of fear washed over me, making my skin prickle. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was out there, standing just feet away from where I lay. I reached slowly for the hunting knife strapped to my belt, my fingers tightening around the handle. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat heavy and loud in my ears. I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible. The presence outside didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. I fought the urge to unzip the tent and look. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know what was standing out there in the dark. Then, without warning, a sound. A deep, slow exhale. Right outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. I clenched my knife tighter, my body stiff with terror. My mind raced through possibilities. If I lunged out with the knife, I'd be completely exposed. If I stayed inside, I had no way of defending myself if it decided to attack. And then movement. Slow, deliberate steps retreating into the woods. Whatever it was leaving. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, gripping my knife, listening. The sounds never returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there in the darkness, just beyond my sight. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was already packing up my gear. I moved quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my pack. The woods were still eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just emptiness. As I slung my pack over my shoulder and took one last look at my campsite, my blood ran cold. Footprints. Deep, unmistakable footprints in the dirt, leading from the trees, stopping right outside my tent. I didn't wait around. I hiked out as fast as I could, pushing through the brush, my knife still in my hand. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack into the bed and got inside, locking the doors. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. Then I started the engine and drove away, leaving that place behind. I don't know what I encountered that night. I don't know if it was just some stranger or something worse, but I do know one thing. I will never camp alone again. I always preferred to camp alone. Something about the silence of the woods, the absence of city noise, the feeling of being completely isolated. It gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. It was the kind of quiet that settled in your bones, the kind that made you aware of every breath you took, every leaf crunching under your boots. I had been camping for years, usually sticking to known trails, but I liked to venture off the beaten path when I could. That's how I ended up at Riverbend, a stretch of wilderness along a winding river, about 50 miles outside of town. It wasn't an official campsite, just a place a few people knew about. I had heard about it from a guy I worked with. Said he used to fish there with his dad when he was younger. I figured it was worth checking out. I packed light. My tent, a sleeping bag, a fishing rod, enough food for a few nights, and a rifle just in case. Not that I expected trouble, but I always carried one when I was alone in the woods. Animals, mostly, though I had never actually needed to use it. The drive took me 3 hours, most of it on cracked pavement, then dirt roads that had been overtaken by weeds. By the time I reached the riverbend, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting a deep orange glow over the trees. The air smelled damp, earthy, the way it does after a recent rain. I set up camp about 20 yards from the water, close enough to hear the gentle rush of the river, far enough that I wouldn't wake up with my tent sitting in a puddle if it rained. I gathered firewood, built a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. The night settled in easily, the temperature dropping just enough to make the warmth of the fire feel good against my skin. The first night was uneventful. I listened to the river, the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the brush. I wasn't new to the sounds of the woods, so nothing seemed out of place. I fell asleep fast, the weight of the long drive pulling me under. The second day was when things started to feel off. I spent the morning fishing, caught a few decent-sized trout. The air was cool, but the sun was warm, and for a while, everything felt perfect. Then, as I was cleaning my catch by the river, I noticed something. Footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were deeper, wider. Someone else had been here, recently, I followed them for a few feet before they disappeared into the trees. They weren't boot prints, whoever it was, they were barefoot. That didn't sit right with me. I wasn't the only one out here. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a hunter, maybe some other camper who had come through earlier in the week. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I built my fire bigger than usual. Not because I was scared, just cautious. The woods had a way of playing tricks on you if you let them. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind rustling the leaves, it could make you feel like something was there when it wasn't. But then, around midnight, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the light steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate human steps. They stopped just beyond the light of my fire. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tight, my heart hammering in my chest. I waited, listening. Then the footsteps moved again, circling my campsite. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. I wanted to call out, but something told me not to. I just listened. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed up my things. I wasn't planning on staying another night, but as I moved around camp, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The footprints from the day before were back. Only this time, there were more of them, and they weren't just around my camp. They were right up to my tent. Someone had been standing inches from where I slept. I grabbed my rifle, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started heading back to my truck. I wasn't running, but I was walking fast. I could feel eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and climbed in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the trees watching me. He was barefoot. His clothes were tattered, dirty, and he was smiling. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. By the time I reached the main road, my hands were shaking. I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see him again. But he was gone. I never went back to Riverbend. I never even told anyone about what happened. But I still think about it. About the footprints. About the footsteps in the night. And about the man at the edge of the woods, smiling. I was never one to be afraid of the outdoors. I grew up in a small town in Montana, surrounded by forests, mountains, and miles of open land. Camping, hiking, and hunting were second nature to me. I'd spent countless nights under the stars, alone or with friends, and never once did I feel unsafe. But that changed one summer when I decided to take a solo camping trip in Idaho's Sawtooth Wilderness. I was 28 at the time. It had been a rough few months. Work had been stressful. My girlfriend and I had split up, and I just needed to clear my head. A weekend alone in the wilderness seemed like the perfect way to reset. I packed up my gear, loaded my truck, and drove 4 hours from my place in Montana to a remote trailhead in Idaho. The plan was simple. Hike in about 10 miles, set up camp near a lake, spend 2 nights there, and then hike back out. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense pine forests and over rocky ridges. The further I got from the road, the quieter it became. By the time I reached the lake in the late afternoon, I hadn't seen another person for hours. That was exactly what I wanted. The lake was tucked into a small valley, surrounded by thick trees on 3 sides, with a rocky shoreline on the 4th. I found a flat spot near the water, set up my tent, and got a fire going before the sun dipped below the treeline. As the night came, everything felt normal. The stars were bright, the air was cool, and the fire crackled softly. I ate my dinner, sipped on some whiskey from my flask, and enjoyed the solitude. Eventually, I crawled into my sleeping bag and dozed off. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. The night was dead silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of insects. That was strange. Usually, the woods were alive at night, even in the dead of summer. Then I heard it, a soft, slow crunching sound. Someone, or something, was walking near my camp. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps were deliberate, careful, not the random scurrying of an animal. They circled my tent, stopping every few steps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My heart pounded in my chest. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off again. In the morning, I stepped outside my tent and looked around. The ground was mostly dirt and pine needles, but I could still make out faint footprints circling my campsite. They were human, barefoot. A cold chill ran down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone on my hike in. There were no other campsites nearby. And who the hell walks around barefoot in the wilderness? I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone was out here just like me. Maybe they got lost and wandered into my camp. It didn't make sense, but I had no better explanation. I decided to stay another night anyway. I had a rifle with me and enough experience in the wild to handle myself. The second day went by quietly. I spent most of it fishing and exploring the area around the lake. But as the sun started to set, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just paranoia. Something felt wrong. The woods were too quiet, like they were holding their breath. That night, I made sure to keep my rifle close. I let the fire burn longer, hoping it would keep anything or anyone away. But just like the night before, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer. I could hear them right outside my tent, slow and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest. I reached for my rifle, but before I could grab it, something pressed against the fabric of my tent. It was a hand, a human hand. I could see the outline through the thin nylon, fingers splayed wide. It stayed there for a long moment, then slowly dragged downward. I snapped. I grabbed my rifle and yanked the zipper open in one motion, jumping out of the tent. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there.
No footprints.
No movement, just the trees standing silently in the night. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, watching the shadows. As soon as the first light crept over the mountains, I packed my gear and got the hell out of there. The hike back felt different. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. I never did, but the feeling of being watched never left. When I got back to my truck, I felt a wave of relief. I tossed my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. Before I pulled out, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and I saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the trees. He was too far away for me to make out his face, but I could see that he was completely naked. His skin was pale, almost gray in the morning light. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there watching me. I didn't stick around. I threw the truck into drive and tore out of there, not looking back. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing. I will never camp alone again.